The ordinary man. The extraordinary meeting. Mark had never thought his life would lead him anywhere beyond the dull gray hallways of Orion Tech, the massive intergalactic corporation that dominated half the trade routes between Earth and dozens of alien worlds. Every day was the same for him, sweeping corridors, cleaning security terminals, and fixing broken equipment that the high-paid engineers didn't care enough to touch. He wore an old maintenance uniform, always smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals. And most people in the towering skyscraper didn't even notice him when they passed. To them, he was invisible, just another janitor. But Mark carried a secret no one around him knew. Something he had never told a soul, except maybe his daughter Lily when she was too young to remember. Late at night, after long shifts and tired evenings, he spent hours in his cramped apartment listening to alien broadcasts on an old, illegally modified receiver. He would play them over and over, slowly piecing together strange syllables, comparing them to the scraps of alien language guides he'd found discarded in Orion Tech's archives. Over the years, he taught himself to understand Valari, the ancient and complex language of one of the most powerful species in the known galaxy. It wasn't just curiosity driving him. It was necessity. Lily was the reason for everything. She was 8 years old now, bright-eyed and full of questions about the stars. Ever since her mother passed away, Mark had promised himself he would give her the kind of life she deserved, even if he had to break every limit placed on him by society. But Orion Tech didn't care about promises or dreams. They only saw him as a worker with a mop, nothing more. He kept his secret close, knowing that if anyone found out he understood Valari, he could lose his job or worse, get tangled up in interstellar politics he had no business touching. That quiet, invisible life shattered on a rainy Tuesday morning. The upper levels of Orion Tech headquarters were buzzing with activity like never before. Word spread quickly among the staff. A delegation from the Valari Alliance had arrived for high-level negotiations. These were not ordinary aliens. These were their leaders, commanders, and chief strategists. Even the company's CEO, who rarely left his private penthouse, had come down to the executive conference wing. Mark, who had been assigned to clean one of the large glass corridors near the meeting hall, found himself moving between groups of nervous human executives, all whispering about the rumored stakes of the discussion. Apparently, Earth's trade agreements with the Valari were on the edge of collapse. A single misunderstanding could ruin decades of cooperation, and worse. Whispers suggested that some factions within Valari leadership believed humans were growing too bold, too demanding, too loud among the stars. Mark leaned on his mop for a moment, staring at the tall silver doors of the negotiation chamber. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this level. Janitors like him were usually kept far from corporate secrets. But Orion Tech needed every maintenance worker to make the place spotless before the aliens arrived, so he had been given access without question. That was when he first heard it, the sharp melodic cadence of the Valari language spilling out from inside the chamber. He froze. He had spent years hearing that sound in old recordings, but hearing it live for the first time sent a shiver up his spine. The words came quickly, layered with tones and subtle inflections, the kind most humans couldn't even distinguish. Mark tilted his head slightly, letting the sound wash over him, carefully piecing together the meaning hidden behind the syllables. Inside, the Valari delegates were arguing fiercely. They believed the humans were deliberately withholding critical star route data that had been promised in earlier treaties. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he understood every word. If the humans didn't clarify the misunderstanding soon, this deal could fall apart, and with it, Earth's fragile alliance with the Valari. He hesitated. He was a janitor, not a diplomat. This wasn't his problem. But then, amid the sharp words, he caught another sound. The voice of Orion Tech's lead negotiator, struggling to respond in broken, heavily accented Valari. The delegates reacted with visible frustration, their voices rising. They thought the humans were mocking them. Mark knew he shouldn't, but his instincts kicked in. He opened his mouth and in a calm, perfectly pitched voice, spoke in fluent Valari. "Honored delegates, there is no insult here. This is a misunderstanding. The humans believe they have already sent the requested data." The words seemed to hang in the air, as though the entire building had suddenly gone silent. 5 alien figures turned their sharp, luminous eyes toward him. Their tall, elegant forms stood like living sculptures carved from obsidian, their translucent skin shimmering faintly under the conference lights. At the center stood Commander Thaler, the Valari executive leading the negotiations, his features marked with intricate tattoos that signified his status. His 4 silver-ringed eyes narrowed in disbelief. A low, resonant hum escaped the throats of the other Valari delegates. Mark realized with growing dread that he had just broken at least a dozen corporate security policies. The humans inside the chamber stared at him, too stunned to speak. "You understand us?" Commander Thaler's voice came deep and smooth, each word vibrating with authority. Mark swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "Yes, I've studied your language." "How?" Thaler stepped closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the floor. "This dialect is forbidden to non-Valari. Even Orion Tech's translators cannot speak it this perfectly." "Where did you learn?" Mark hesitated, searching for words. "Old broadcasts. Fragments of your literature stored in Orion Tech's archives. I taught myself." Thaler regarded him in silence for several long seconds. Then, without warning, the alien executive turned to Orion Tech's negotiators. "This human will remain," he said in flawless English, his voice smooth yet commanding. "We will hear the rest of your proposals through him." The humans protested instantly. "He's just a janitor," one of the senior executives blurted out, his face pale with shock. "He doesn't represent Orion Tech." "Silence," Thaler interrupted sharply. "He speaks Valari better than any of you. He stays." Mark stood frozen, his heart hammering inside his chest. He didn't understand how his life had flipped upside down in seconds. A moment ago, he was invisible. Now all eyes, human and alien, were on him. As the meeting resumed, Mark translated carefully, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Every syllable mattered. Every word carried meaning that could decide the fate of 2 species. He felt the immense pressure, but deep down, a strange sense of belonging began to stir. When the session ended hours later, Thaler approached him privately. The alien executive studied him closely, his silver-rimmed eyes unreadable. "A simple janitor who speaks forbidden tongues," he said softly. "You are either dangerous or extraordinary. We will find out which." Mark didn't answer. All he could think about was Lily, waiting for him at home, and the storm he had just walked into without meaning to. That night, as he returned to his small apartment, the city lights of Earth glittering below, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be the same again. Somewhere deep inside, he sensed this was only the beginning of something far greater than he could have imagined. Something that could change not only his future, but the future of all humanity. The alien executive's interest. The next morning, Mark woke up long before sunrise, his small apartment still dark and silent, except for the gentle hum of the city beyond the thin walls. Lily was curled up on the couch under a warm blanket, breathing softly in her sleep, and for a moment he just sat there watching her, the innocence on her face, calming the storm that had been raging inside him since yesterday. Everything had changed in a matter of hours, and he could not shake the weight of it from his shoulders. He remembered every detail. From the meeting, the way the Valari delegates had turned their piercing, luminous eyes on him, the way Commander Thaler's voice had carried both curiosity and authority, when he demanded to know how a janitor could speak a forbidden's alien language. So perfectly, Mark had expected to be punished, expected Orion Tech security to fire him on the spot, maybe even hand him over to government officials. But instead, something stranger had happened. Thaler had insisted that Mark remain in the negotiations and act as an intermediary. The humans had reluctantly agreed, and by the end of the day it was as if he had stepped through a doorway into an entirely different world. But now the reality of what he had done was sinking in. Orion Tech would not let this pass quietly. He had drawn attention to himself in front of two powerful forces, one corporate and one interstellar, both of which had little tolerance for mistakes or secrets. He looked down at his hands resting on the chipped wooden table and realized they were trembling. He clenched them tightly and whispered to himself that he had to stay calm for Lily's sake. No matter what happened, he had to protect her and make sure she was safe. By mid-morning, his fears were confirmed. Orion Tech summoned him to the upper executive floors, something that had never happened in his 5 years working there. The receptionist barely glanced at him as she scanned his ID and directed him toward a sleek elevator lined with polished steel. The ride up felt endless, the numbers climbing steadily until the doors opened. Into a wide hallway of glass and light. At the far end stood a pair of tall security guards, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors. They stepped aside without a word as he approached and ushered him into a large meeting room. Inside were 3 Orion Tech executives seated around an oval table, their faces tense and unreadable. At the far corner of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, stood Commander Thaler, his heightened presence dominating the space. Mark felt an immediate tightness in his chest when their eyes met. One of the executives, a thin man with sharp cheekbones and an expression that hinted at suppressed anger, gestured for him to sit. His voice clipped and cold when he spoke. Mr. Mark, we need to understand exactly what happened yesterday. Mark tried to explain, keeping his voice steady. He told them about his long night spent studying Valari, how he had pieced the language together from scraps of information and old broadcasts. He left out the part about accessing restricted archives. He wasn't sure if they knew about that, and he wasn't ready to risk admitting it. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Thaler spoke, his deep voice resonating through the air. This human speaks Valari, not just fluently, but with precision rare. Even among our own, he understands tonal shifts and ancestral dialects most translators cannot reproduce. I want to know why. Mark hesitated, meeting Thaler's gaze. I learned because I wanted to understand your people. I thought, maybe if I understood your words, I could understand your history too. Thaler regarded him silently for several seconds, his 4 silver-rimmed eyes studying every detail of Mark's face as though searching for any hint of deceit. Finally he spoke again. Your reason is simple, yet your skill is not. It is unusual. I do not believe in coincidences. Before Mark could respond, the Orion Tech executives cut in, one of them leaning forward with a sharp tone. Commander Thaler, with respect, this man is not an authorized representative of Orion Tech. We cannot allow a janitor to be involved in sensitive negotiations. Thaler's gaze shifted slowly toward the speaker, and when he spoke again, his voice was low but carried a weight that silenced the room. You will allow it if you wish these talks to continue. The executive swallowed hard, clearly fighting back his frustration, but he said nothing more. Thaler turned back to Mark. You will meet me privately after this. I wish to test the depth of your knowledge. That afternoon, Mark found himself following the alien commander through a quiet side corridor of Orion Tech's upper levels until they reached a sealed chamber. The door slid open with a soft chime, revealing a room lined with faintly glowing panels and strange holographic inscriptions hovering in the air. Inside were 2 other Valari officers, their elegant forms framed by translucent robes. They regarded Mark with open curiosity as Thaler gestured for him to step forward. Translate this, Thaler said as one of the officers activated a projection of an ancient Valari text. The characters spiraled like flowing rivers of light there, meaning deeply rooted in concepts no human culture had words for. Mark took a breath, letting his mind slow as he read the phrases out loud, his voice soft but steady. When he finished, the chamber fell silent again. The Valari officers exchanged surprised Glances one of them murmured something to Thaler in a dialect even more obscure than the last, and Mark instinctively responded without thinking, perfectly matching the rhythm and cadence of their tones. This time even Thaler looked momentarily unsettled, his sharp features tightening as if he had just uncovered something unexpected. "You speak the old tongue," Thaler said slowly, his voice carrying both admiration and suspicion. "These words are kept hidden from most, even among my people, and yet you know them." Mark hesitated. He thought about telling him the truth about the fragments of Valari archives he had stumbled upon deep in Orion Tech's restricted servers, but some instinct told him to keep that part hidden for now. "Learned what I could," he said carefully. "I didn't know some of it was forbidden." Thaler studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke again. "Perhaps you are telling the truth, or perhaps Orion Tech uses you in ways you do not understand. But one thing is clear, human, your knowledge places you in danger. There are factions among my people who would see you silenced rather than allow such secrets to exist outside Valari control." Mark felt a chill run through him. He had always thought of his late-night studies as harmless, a personal obsession, nothing more. But now he realized he had stepped into a world where every word carried weight, where knowledge itself could be a weapon. When he left the chamber later that evening, his mind was heavy with questions and fears. Outside the city, lights stretched endlessly below, but he barely saw them. He thought of Lily at home waiting for him. He thought of the Valari and their ancient secrets. He thought of Orion Tech's growing interest in him and how all of it was starting to close around him like tightening walls. Somewhere deep down, though, beneath the fear was something else. Too, a spark of determination. He had spent years living quietly, unseen and unheard, but now he was being pulled into something greater, something that could decide not just his own future, but the fragile balance between two species. And for Lily's sake, if nothing else, he knew he had to survive whatever was coming. Secrets revealed. Mark barely slept that night, his mind restless with thoughts that refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thaler's expression in honoring that private chamber, the surprise, the suspicion, and the quiet weight behind his words. "Knowledge places you in danger." The phrase kept circling in his head like a distant echo. He turned over on the worn couch beside Lily, who had fallen asleep while reading one of her books about the stars. She loved asking him questions about other worlds, questions he had always answered with small half-truths to keep her safe. Now he wondered how much longer he could keep pretending that his life was simple. Morning came, and the apartment filled with the pale light of dawn. Mark went through his usual routine, making breakfast, packing Lily's bag for school, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept replaying fragments of the meeting and the test with the Valari, wondering what would happen next. His chest tightened when he thought about Orion Tech. They were powerful and secretive. If they decided he was a liability, there would be no appeals, no explanations. He could disappear overnight, and no one would even know why. When he arrived at Orion Tech headquarters later that morning, the air was heavy with tension. Entire sections of the upper floors had been closed off. Security checkpoints were tighter than usual. Whispers moved through the staff about delays in the negotiations, rumors about Valari threats, and quiet talk of potential sanctions against Earth. Mark kept his head down, but he could feel eyes following him everywhere he went. Just before noon, a message arrived on his maintenance terminal, instructing him to report to a secure level deep within Orion Tech. He hesitated at first, but there was no refusing a direct summons. When he arrived, 2 guards led him into an isolated chamber, unlike any he had ever seen before. The walls were lined with dark glass, pulsing faintly with streaks of blue light. At the center stood Thaler and 3 Valari officers, their tall forms shimmering faintly in the filtered light. Color turned as Mark entered, his expression unreadable. "Come closer, human," he said, his voice calm but carrying authority. "There is something you must see." One of the Valari officers activated a holographic display. A star map filled the room, the projection showing dozens of glowing points connected by intricate pathways. Mark's breath caught as he recognized the pattern. Some of the symbols were identical to the fragments he had discovered years ago hidden deep in Orion Tech's maintenance archives. Thaler studied him closely. "Do you understand what you are looking at?" Mark hesitated, his voice low, when he replied, "These are Valari star roots, the ancient ones before the current expansion." The Valari officers exchanged looks, murmuring softly among themselves. Thaler remained silent for a moment, then finally spoke. "This information is classified. Even among my own kind, few living Valari know these roots yet. You speak as though they are familiar to you." Mark shifted uneasily, his palms damp, as he debated whether to tell the truth. If Thaler discovered he had accessed Orion Tech's restricted archives without permission, it could make things worse, but lying to him might be even more dangerous. Finally he spoke, carefully choosing each word. "Years ago I was cleaning one of the old maintenance servers. I found fragments of your language hidden in encrypted files. I studied them because I was curious. I didn't know what they really were." Thaler's gaze hardened, but there was something else in his expression. Too, not just anger, but thoughtfulness. "If Orion Tech has access to this knowledge, they should not. It belongs to my people. This means someone inside your corporation has been keeping secrets they should not have." Mark felt his stomach tighten, a cold unease settling into him. Why would Orion Tech have this information? Thaler's voice lowered, his tone sharp like steel. "Because they seek control over things they do not understand, and that makes them dangerous. There are whispers among my people that certain factions within Orion Tech are attempting to manipulate the alliance between our species for their own benefit. And if they succeed, the consequences will be catastrophic for both sides." Before Mark could respond, an alarm sounded, deep and low, vibrating through the walls. One of the Valari officers touched a panel and a flurry of alien symbols appeared on the holographic display. Thaler scanned the data, his expression darkening. "The negotiations have been compromised. A message intercepted between Orion Tech's directors and a rival alien faction suggests an attempt to frame the Valari for sabotage." Mark stared at him, confused. "Sabotage of what?" "Your orbital spaceports," Thaler replied gravely. "If the humans believe we are attacking their infrastructure, war is inevitable." The words sank into Mark like cold water. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. Earth and the Valari standing on the edge of open conflict, and he was caught in the middle of it. Thaler stepped closer, his silver-rimmed eyes locked on Mark. "You have a choice, human. You can walk away from this and pretend none of it concerns you, or you can help me prove the truth and prevent a war." Mark hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of Lily, thought of her small hands holding his, thought of her bright questions about the stars and what waited beyond them. He knew that if war came, it would not just be soldiers and politicians who suffered. It would be children like her, families like his people, caught in the fire for reasons they could not control. "I'll help you," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear rising inside him. "Tell me what I need to do." Thaler nodded slightly, his expression softening for the first time. "Good then. Listen carefully." For the next hour they studied the intercepted communications together. Mark translated parts of the messages written in an obscure Valari dialect, cross-referencing them with Orion Tech's internal codes. The pieces slowly came together, revealing a complex conspiracy. Orion Tech's upper management had forged alien transmissions to make it appear as though the Valari were planning to disable Earth's orbital defenses. In reality, the intercepted signals were warnings from the Valari about a third-party faction manipulating events from the shadows, a species unknown to most of the galaxy. When they finally stepped out of the chamber, the world outside felt different too. Mark, heavier and sharper, every sound, every distant voice carrying a sense of urgency. He knew too much now, and there was no going back. That evening, as he returned home, the city felt quieter than usual, the neon lights of the upper levels glowing faintly in the mist. He walked through the narrow streets thinking of what Thaler had revealed. Orion Tech was playing a dangerous game, The Valari were divided, and somewhere, out there in the cold dark between the stars, an unknown force was pulling strings to push two civilizations toward conflict. When he reached his apartment, Lily ran to greet him, her laughter bright and warm against the chaos in his head. He hugged her tightly, trying to hide the fear gnawing at him, but deep inside he understood the truth. His life had changed forever. He was no longer just a janitor, no longer invisible. He was standing at the center of something vast and dangerous, and the days ahead would test everything he thought he knew about himself and the universe. The rising stakes. Mark woke the next morning with a restless feeling that had settled deep inside his chest, the weight of everything he had learned pressing heavily against him. The city outside his apartment window buzzed as it always did, with transport drones flashing through the mist and voices carrying faintly from crowded streets. But for Mark, the world no longer felt the same. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow seemed heavier. Since stepping into that hidden chamber with Thaler, he had seen pieces of a truth bigger than he had ever imagined, and there was no turning back. He moved quietly around the apartment preparing breakfast while Lily still slept curled beneath her blanket on the couch, her soft breathing steady and calm. She looked so peaceful that it made his heart ache. He wished he could keep her in that quiet world where everything was simple and safe, but deep down he knew that safety was only an illusion. If Orion Tech's plan succeeded, if the Valari misread their intentions, the war that would follow would reach every home, every street, and no one would be untouched. When he reached Orion Tech headquarters later that morning, the air was electric with tension. Security had doubled overnight. The lobbies were crowded with officials, military advisors, and envoys from other species. Mark walked through the vast corridors, trying to make himself invisible as he had done for years, but he could feel eyes following him, whispers trailing behind him. Some of the executives already knew who he was now, the janitor who spoke Valari perfectly, the one Thaler had chosen to trust, and for many in Orion Tech that made him dangerous. Before he could even begin his shift, an alert flashed on his maintenance terminal, summoning him to the restricted upper floors again. He arrived to find Thaler waiting along with two Valari officers, their tall, graceful forms standing out against the sleek glass walls. Thaler's expression was more serious than ever as he gestured for Mark to follow him into another secure chamber. Inside the room, a large holographic display hovered above the table, showing streams of intercepted communications, symbols flashing and shifting like patterns of living light. Thaler spoke quietly, but his voice carried Enkolkuri's unshakable authority. We have confirmed Orion Tech's deception. Their executives have forged Valari codes to create the illusion of sabotage. Our people intercepted another message last night. This one was not meant to be seen. It proves that Orion Tech intends to push both our species into conflict and profit from the chaos. Mark felt a cold unease settling into him. But if you know this, why not reveal it now? Thaler turned his four-ringed gaze toward him, the silver patterns in his eyes gleaming faintly. Because your people will not believe us. Orion Tech controls the flow of information. They have already planted false reports in your government systems. They will frame us before we can speak, and by the time the truth reaches anyone, it will be too late. Mark understood immediately why Thaler had called him here. He was the only human both sides might trust. He was neither Valari nor Orion Tech. He was someone invisible until now, someone no one had thought to manipulate. Thaler confirmed his suspicion a moment later. You must stand between them, Thaler said slowly. Your voice is the only one that can reach both sides without being dismissed. We need you to translate the intercepted codes and present them at the Grand Treaty Summit tomorrow. If we fail, humanity and Valari will both burn. The words hit Mark with the weight of a collapsing star. He had never imagined himself standing before leaders and diplomats deciding the fate of worlds. But when he thought of Lily, when he imagined the possibility of her growing up in a galaxy torn apart by war, he felt the fear inside him shift into something else. Determination. He nodded slowly, his voice steady. I'll do it, but how do we even get Into the summit. Orion Tech will have security everywhere. Thaler glanced at his officers, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. There are factions among my people who oppose me. They do not want this alliance to survive. They will not hesitate to silence you before you can speak. We cannot simply walk in. We will need proof, undeniable and clear. If we fail, Orion Tech will spin any words we speak as lies. Mark spent the rest of the day working with Thaler, decoding layers of encrypted Velari dialects buried within Orion Tech's forged transmissions. What they discovered chilled him to the bone. Not only had Orion Tech fabricated evidence of sabotage, they had also been secretly collaborating with an unknown alien faction, one so hidden that even the Velari knew little about them. This third party had promised Orion Tech advanced technology and control over certain star systems if they succeeded in dismantling the Velari alliance. Mark realized then that humanity's leaders were walking into a trap set by their own kind. Night had fallen by the time he returned home, the city alive with the glow of neon lights and distant drone traffic. Lily was sitting at the small table drawing pictures of planets and stars. She looked up as he walked in and smiled brightly, unaware of the weight hanging over him. He hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, as if grounding himself in the one thing that still felt real. He stayed awake long after she had gone to bed, staring out at the endless sprawl of the city below him, the tall towers piercing the clouds, the stars faintly visible beyond their glow. Somewhere up there, fleets of Velari ships waited, their commanders watching closely, and on the ground powerful corporations and hidden factions moved pieces like a game Mark had never asked to play. But now he was a piece on the board, and he had to decide how to move. Following day arrived faster than he wanted. The Grand Treaty Summit was set in Orion Tech's highest council chamber, a towering space of glass and steel suspended hundreds of meters above the city. Below, representatives from Earth, the Velari, and several neutral factions were present. The atmosphere was tense, every whisper heavy with suspicion. Security drones lined the walls. Armed soldiers from both species stood ready in case anything went wrong. Mark followed Thaler into the chamber, his heart pounding, but his steps steady. Orion Tech's executives were already seated at the central table, their expressions carefully composed, hiding their schemes behind polite masks. One of them glanced at Mark with thinly veiled contempt, clearly unhappy about his presence. As the summit began, accusations erupted almost immediately. Orion Tech's lead negotiator presented falsified data claiming Velari ships had already begun hacking into Earth's orbital defenses. Velari delegates responded sharply, their voices carrying anger and warning. The room teetered on the edge of chaos. Mark waited for Thaler's signal, and when it came he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising noise. He began translating the intercepted communications, his words flowing and flawless Velari, and then back into clear English, revealing line by line how Orion Tech had manipulated transmissions, how they had conspired with an unknown faction, and how the supposed sabotage was nothing more than a staged lie. Gasps rippled through the chamber, but Orion Tech's executives struck back quickly, accusing Mark of fabricating everything. They demanded proof. Thaler raised his hand, and one of his officers activated a holographic display showing the original unaltered messages, captured directly from Velari systems, their authenticity verified by multiple neutral factions present at the summit. For a moment there was silence, the kind that feels like the air has been pulled from the room. Then chaos erupted. Orion Tech's leaders shouted denials, but their voices were drowned out by the evidence. Representatives from other factions demanded investigations. Velari delegates stood taller, their anger sharp but contained. Thaler's voice rose above it all, commanding and steady, as he declared that the Velari sought peace, not war. Mark stood there breathing hard, his chest tight, but he didn't step back. He had crossed the line. There was no hiding anymore. He knew Orion Tech would not forgive him for this, but he also knew something else. The truth was out, and that changed everything. As the summit adjourned, Thaler approached him, quietly placing a hand on his shoulder. You have done more today than most could dream. You have given both our peoples a chance at peace, but be prepared, human. Orion Tech will not forget. And neither will those who profit from chaos. Mark nodded silently, feeling the weight of what was still to come that night. As he returned home and watched Lily sleeping, he finally allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in days he felt a fragile sense of hope, but he knew the game was far from over. The final gambit. Morning after the summit, the city seemed quieter than usual, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mark stood on the balcony of his small apartment, staring at the mist-covered towers that rose into the clouds, the hum of distant transport ships faint in the background. He felt exhausted, but his mind would not rest. The summit had ended without open conflict. The danger was far from over. Orion Tech had been publicly exposed, yet the corporation was vast, powerful, and deeply rooted in Earth's political systems. They would not simply accept defeat. He glanced back into the apartment, where Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, eating her cereal and watching an old animated series. She smiled at him between spoonfuls, completely unaware of the storm swirling around them. Mark forced a smile back at her, but deep inside he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. Everything he had done, every risk he had taken was for her, but now their lives were tangled in forces much bigger than he had ever imagined. By the time he reached Orion Tech headquarters later that morning, the situation had grown even more tense. Security was everywhere. Armed drones drifted through the upper corridors, scanning badges and faces, while human and Velari officers stood side by side, forming uneasy checkpoints. The summit had revealed truths that could not be hidden anymore, and factions were scrambling to control the narrative. Vethaler was waiting for him in a private chamber, his tall, elegant frame standing by a transparent wall overlooking the city below. The silver-ringed patterns in his eyes reflected the morning light. When Mark stepped inside, Thaler turned his gaze sharp and focused. "The neutral factions have confirmed the evidence you provided," he said, his deep voice calm but firm. "Orion Tech's deception is undeniable. The Council has called for a full investigation into their leadership, and several of their directors are already under arrest." Mark felt a flicker of relief, but Thaler's expression remained grave. "Do not mistake this for victory, human. Orion Tech is powerful. Their influence runs deep, even beyond Earth. There are still those loyal to them who will try to erase the truth before it spreads." Mark nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" Thaler stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The unknown faction, the ones Orion Tech worked with, they will not simply vanish. They wanted war between our species for a reason, and until we uncover who they are and what they want, neither of us is safe. I suspect they are already moving pieces we cannot yet see." Mark understood immediately. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a larger game. But he also knew he had no choice anymore. He was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. Later that afternoon, Thaler invited him to the Velari embassy for the first time. The structure stood on the edge of the city, a tall spire of black glass and shifting energy fields that seemed almost alive. When Mark stepped inside, he felt as though he had walked into another world. Luminous patterns danced across the walls, forming shapes and symbols his human mind struggled to comprehend. Velari delegates moved silently through the halls, their robes flowing softly, their gestures precise and deliberate. Thaler led him into a quiet chamber filled with star maps and floating archives, ancient data stored in shimmering strands of light. "These are records of Velari history," Thaler explained, his voice lower, now almost reverent. "Long ago our people fought a great war against a species we call the Velex, a hidden race that thrives on conflict and division. They nearly destroyed half our worlds before they vanished into the dark between the stars. Now I believe they are returning, and if I am right, they are the ones who pushed Orion Tech to betray us." Mark stared at the swirling patterns of light, the weight of what Thaler said settling into him slowly. So all of this, the sabotage, the forged messages, the summit, everything was just to start another war. "Yes," Thaler said simply. "And if we had fallen for their trap, they would have succeeded. But now they will try again, and next time they will be more careful. Mark thought of Lily and felt a chill run through him. He had stepped into something that stretched far beyond Earth, far beyond anything he had imagined. But there was no way to turn back now. Over the next 2 days, Mark worked alongside Thaler and a team of Valari analysts decoding fragments of intercepted transmissions. The pattern suggested the Valex were already embedding operatives within Orion Tech and even certain government bodies on Earth. The danger was no longer distant. It was here, woven into the fabric of human institutions. Mark realized they could not rely on officials or leaders who might already be compromised. If they wanted to stop what was coming, they would have to act quietly, carefully, and quickly. Then came the call for the Grand Council Assembly, a rare gathering of leaders from across human and Valari territories, as well as several neutral factions. It would decide the future of the Alliance and set policies for defense, trade, and joint exploration projects. But Orion Tech still had allies within the Council, allies who would try to sway the decision and twist the narrative. Mark knew he had to be there. He was the only human the Valari trusted completely, and the only one capable of exposing any hidden manipulation before it succeeded. The assembly chamber was unlike anything Mark had ever seen. A vast circular hall suspended high above the city, its walls transparent, so the skyline stretched endlessly around them. Thousands of delegates filled the seats, while towering holographic displays projected live translations into dozens of languages. At the center stood a raised platform where speakers would address the council. As the debates began, Orion Tech's remaining representatives struck first, arguing that the Valari could not be trusted and pushing for Earth to strengthen its military instead of rebuilding the Alliance. Their words were careful, rehearsed, delivered with polished authority. But beneath the surface, Mark recognized the same patterns of manipulation he had seen in the forged transmissions. When his turn came, he stepped onto the platform, his palms damp, but his voice steady as he spoke. He switched effortlessly between English and Valari so that every delegate understood him directly. He laid out the evidence, clearly explaining how Orion Tech had been manipulated by a hidden faction, how the intercepted codes revealed layers of deception designed to provoke war, and how the future of both species depended on cooperation, not division. There was silence when he finished. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Then murmurs began spreading through the crowd as delegates conferred among themselves. The Valari representative stood in solemn support of his words, Thaler himself stepping forward to confirm everything Mark had said. The tide turned slowly but unmistakably. Neutral factions began siding with the Valari. A motion was passed to suspend Orion Tech's authority over interstellar treaties and initiate a joint investigation into the Valex infiltration. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt the faint stirrings of hope. When the assembly adjourned, Thaler approached him, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. You have done more than speak words, human. You have altered the path of 2 civilizations. Mark breathed deeply, letting the weight of it all settle into him. Finally, he felt something he had not felt in years: pride, not just for surviving, but for standing up when it mattered most. He looked back at Thaler and nodded. I didn't do it alone. Thaler's silver-ringed eyes softened faintly. No, but few would have had the courage to try. That night when Mark returned home, Lily ran into his arms laughing, as though nothing in the universe could touch her, and for the first time since this began, he allowed himself to believe she might have a chance at a future free from the shadows of war. The city outside still hummed with tension and unanswered questions, but a fragile peace had been secured for now. Humanity had earned the respect of the Valari and a place at the table among the stars, and Mark the Janitor, who once swept forgotten corridors, now carried the knowledge and responsibility of 2 worlds on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he no longer felt invisible. He had found his voice, and with it he had changed the fate of not just himself and his daughter, but an entire galaxy. And somewhere deep in the silent dark between distant stars, unseen eyes Watched and waited. The Valex were not finished yet, but neither was he the end.